Sometimes the smallest acts of kindness echo the loudest in places the world has forgotten. Every person who's ever felt invisible, who's ever wondered if their daily choices matter, will understand what happens next in this forgotten corner of Montana. Chester Hayes walks the same dusty path every morning in Copper Ridge, carrying scraps to 7 dogs who wait for him like old friends. This weathered man thinks he's just feeding strays in a dying town. He doesn't know these dogs belong to Vivienne Sterling, a wealthy widow watching from her mansion on the bluff. She released them years ago, hoping someone might still show kindness in this broken place. 2 lonely souls, both caring for the same creatures, neither knowing the other exists. But what happens when these 2 finally meet and discover the truth they've been living? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The old church bell that Chester Hayes rang each dawn had been silent for 3 years before he claimed it. Nobody in Copper Ridge seemed to mind when the weathered man climbed the rickety steps of the abandoned Methodist church and gave the bronze bell its voice again. The sound carried across the valley like a promise kept, though Chester never thought of it in such grand terms. To him, it was simply time to begin another day. His leather-bound journal lay open on the kitchen table, waiting for the morning's entry. The pages, yellowed with age and coffee stains, held 2 years' worth of careful observations. Cloudy, 38 degrees. Rex, favoring left front paw. Duchess ate well. Storm, coming from the west. The entries revealed a methodical mind that found comfort in routine, though Chester would have bristled at such analysis. He was just a man who noticed things, nothing more. The cabin where Chester lived sat on the edge of town, like a period at the end of a sentence nobody wanted to finish. Built from lodgepole pine and held together by stubbornness, it had weathered 40 Montana winters without complaint. Inside, everything had its place. The cast-iron stove that heated coffee, black as motor oil, the wooden table his grandfather had built, the single chair worn smooth by decades of solitary meals. A rifle hung above the door, more from habit than necessity. Chester Hayes had learned long ago that the most dangerous predators walked on 2 legs, and they rarely ventured this far into forgotten country. The 7 dogs appeared each morning like ghosts materializing from mist. Chester had named them himself over the months. Rex, the German shepherd mix with intelligent eyes and graying muzzle, who seemed to lead the pack. Duchess, a golden retriever whose coat caught the early light like spun gold. Shadow, the black lab, who preferred to watch from distances. Bandit, the terrier mix with one white ear that made him look perpetually curious. Scout, the border collie whose herding instincts kept the group together. Penny, the copper-colored spaniel who reminded Chester of autumn leaves. And Murphy, the old hound whose mournful eyes spoke of stories Chester wished he could understand. They gathered at the corner of Main and Prospect Streets, patient as the mountains themselves. Chester talked to them while he distributed the scraps he'd saved from his simple meals, his voice carrying the kind of gentle authority that suggested he'd once commanded respect from more than just dogs. "Morning, Rex. How's that paw treating you?" "Duchess, you're looking fine today." "Shadow, come on out where I can see you proper." The dogs responded to his voice with the kind of trust that takes time to build. They didn't cower or compete for food like strays might. Instead, they waited their turns, almost polite in their hunger. Chester noticed these things but filed them away without deeper thought. Good dogs, he told himself. Someone raised them right before the world went sideways. Copper Ridge spread before him like a testament to better times. Main Street stretched 3 blocks between the defunct railroad station and the boarded-up mine office, lined with buildings that had once bustled with purpose. The general store still operated, run by Frank Kowalski, a Polish immigrant who'd stayed when everyone else left, because, as he put it, someone has to keep the lights on. The post office occupied half of what used to be the bank, staffed by Nancy Chen, whose family had come west to build the railroad and never left. Doc Palmer maintained his veterinary practice in a building that had once housed the town's only doctor, serving the scattered ranches that dotted the valley like periods of hope in a long, difficult sentence. These were Chester's people now, though he'd never presumed to claim them. They nodded when he passed, offered weather observations and gentle complaints about government incompetence, but respected the boundaries that solitary people build around themselves. Chester appreciated this courtesy more than they knew. The town's decline told itself in empty windows and peeling paint. The Copper Ridge Hotel stood like a dowager fallen on hard times, its Victorian gingerbread trim weathered grey and windows dark. The hardware store had closed 2 winters, back when old Mr. Patterson died and his children moved to cities with more opportunity and less snow. Even the saloon, renamed Murphy's Tavern in a failed attempt at respectability, opened only on weekends now, serving mostly ranch hands and the occasional lost tourist. But it was the mine that had truly broken Copper Ridge's back. The Consolidated Mining Company had pulled out 5 years ago when copper prices fell and easier ore was found in South America. They'd left behind a poisoned creek, a scarred mountainside, and a town full of people who'd built their lives around digging wealth from stone. Some families had followed the company to other sites. Others had moved to Billings or Helena, seeking work in a world that no longer needed what they knew how to do. Those who remained carried the weight of watching their home die by degrees. Chester understood something about watching things die. He'd learned that lesson in a place whose name he no longer spoke aloud, where he'd made decisions that haunted his sleep and saved his life in the same breath. The army had called it tactical excellence. Chester called it Tuesday and tried not to think about it at all. From his cabin, he could see the mansion on the bluff that overlooked the town like a benevolent eye. Local gossip had it that some rich widow lived up there, though nobody seemed to know much about her. The house itself commanded respect, a sprawling log and stone structure that suggested both wealth and taste. Chester had seen smoke from its chimneys and occasionally noticed a black sedan winding down the mountain road. But the owner remained as mysterious as morning fog. "She's got money," Frank Kowalski had mentioned once while Chester bought coffee and canned goods. "Buys supplies through delivery services from Helena. Never comes into town that I've seen. Nancy thinks she's probably some Hollywood type who wanted a hideaway." Chester didn't much care about Hollywood types or their hideaways. Rich people had their reasons for the things they did, same as everyone else. What puzzled him was how well-fed the dogs looked for strays, how their coats stayed clean despite living rough, how they seemed to know things that dogs shouldn't know if they'd been abandoned to survive on their own. Doc Palmer might have answers, but Doc Palmer was the kind of man who kept his own counsel. He'd treated Rex's injured paw 2 months back without asking too many questions about ownership or payment. When Chester had tried to settle the bill, Doc had waved him off. "Dogs need looking after," he'd said. "Doesn't much matter who's doing the looking." The morning routine never varied. Bell at dawn, coffee strong enough to wake the dead, journal entry recording the previous day's observations. Then Chester would load his battered canvas sack with scraps and walk the quarter-mile into town, following a path he'd worn smooth with repetition. The dogs would be waiting, and for 20 minutes, Chester Hayes would remember what it felt like to be needed. He told himself it was just feeding strays. But in the quiet moments before sleep, when the mountain wind rattled his windows and loneliness pressed against his chest like a physical weight, Chester knew better. These dogs had become his family, his anchor to a world that had shifted beneath his feet too many times to count. They asked nothing but kindness and gave back loyalty that humbled him. What Chester didn't know, what he couldn't have imagined, as he carefully portioned out morning scraps and spoke to his 4-legged congregation, was that every step of his routine was observed by eyes that understood exactly what he was doing and why it mattered. High on the bluff, behind windows that reflected the rising sun like shields, Vivienne Sterling watched the man who had unknowingly become the answer to a question she'd been asking for 2 years. The test she'd devised seemed simple enough. Release 7 well-trained dogs into a dying town and see if anyone still possessed the capacity for kindness without reward. She'd expected failure, or at best, grudging tolerance. What she'd found instead was Chester Hayes, a man who talked to dogs like family and never asked for anything in return. And now, watching him through binoculars she kept on the windowsill for this exact purpose, Vivienne Sterling began to wonder if her test had revealed more about Copper Ridge and about the possibility of hope in forgotten places than she'd been prepared to discover. The brass property deed lay hidden in Vivienne Sterling's safe, its ornate lettering spelling out ownership of nearly 3/4 of Copper Ridge. She'd inherited the documents along with everything else when Richard died, but the weight of that responsibility felt heavier each morning as she watched the town continue its slow decline. The deed represented power she'd never asked for, and decisions she wasn't sure she was qualified to make. Chester noticed Rex's limp before the dog reached their usual meeting spot. The German shepherd's gait carried a hitch that hadn't been there the day before, and when Chester knelt to examine him, Rex whimpered a sound that cut through the morning air like a blade. Blood matted the fur around his left rear leg, and when Chester gently probed the wound, he felt something that shouldn't be there, a jagged piece of glass embedded deep in the muscle. "Easy, boy," Chester murmured, his voice carrying the kind of calm authority that came from experience with pain and fear. "We're going to get you fixed up." The other 6 dogs sensed something wrong. They gathered closer than usual, their body language tense with concern that seemed almost human in its intensity. Duchess pressed against Rex's good side, while Shadow paced in tight circles, whining low in his throat. The pack's distress told Chester this wasn't just about an injured member. These dogs cared for each other with a depth that spoke of bonds forged over time, not the casual associations of strays thrown together by circumstance. Chester carefully lifted Rex, surprised by how easily the dog submitted to being carried. Most strays, especially injured ones, would fight or flee rather than trust human hands. But Rex settled against Chester's chest with the resigned patience of an animal that had known gentle treatment before. The weight of him, solid and warm, reminded Chester of carrying wounded soldiers, a comparison that arrived unbidden and unwelcome. The walk to Doc Palmer's clinic took Chester deeper into town than his usual routine. Loud. Main Street looked different from this angle, more desperate somehow. The for sale sign in front of the old barber shop had weathered to illegibility. Mrs. Morrison's boarding house displayed a rooms available placard that never came down because there were never any takers. Even the wind seemed to carry defeat, rattling loose shutters and stirring dust devils in empty lots where buildings used to stand. As Chester approached the clinic, he became aware of being watched. The sensation prickled along his spine, a survival instinct honed by years when being observed meant being targeted. He turned casually, scanning the street behind him, and caught a glimpse of black sedan parked at the corner of Main and Prospect. The windows were tinted too dark to see inside, but something about the vehicle's stillness suggested patient observation rather than casual stopping. Doc Palmer emerged from his clinic before Chester could knock, as if he'd been expecting this visit. The veterinarian was a compact man in his 60s, with hands that moved with surgeon's precision and eyes that missed nothing. He'd served as the town's unofficial physician for animals, and when necessary, people who couldn't afford the drive to Helena for medical care. "Bring him inside," Doc said without preamble. "I saw you coming up the street." The clinic smelled of antiseptic and old leather, with undertones of hay and something that might have been hope. Chester laid Rex on the examination table and stepped back, watching Doc's experienced hands explore the wound with gentle thoroughness. "Glass," Doc confirmed. "Deep, but it missed the major blood vessels. Lucky dog." He glanced at Chester. "You want to tell me how a stray got hold of a piece of crystal this fine?" Chester leaned closer. In the clinic's bright lights, he could see that the embedded glass wasn't the rough, green-tinged shards that littered the alleys behind Copper Ridge's abandoned buildings. This was clear, with beveled edges that caught the light like jewelry. "That's not from around here," Chester said. "No," Doc agreed. "That's from a wine glass or maybe a brandy snifter. Expensive crystal, from the look of it. The kind of thing you'd find in houses with more money than most folks see in a lifetime." While Doc worked to remove the glass, Chester found himself studying Rex with new eyes. The dog's coat, beneath the dust and matted blood, showed signs of regular grooming. His teeth were clean, his nails trimmed. This wasn't an animal that had been living rough for months. This was a dog that someone had been caring for, and caring for, well. "Doc," Chester said carefully, "what do you know about these dogs?" Palmer's hands never paused in their work, but his shoulders tensed slightly. "Know about dogs in general, or these dogs specifically? You know what I'm asking?" Doc Palmer finished removing the glass and began cleaning the wound. Rex lay still throughout the procedure, occasionally lifting his head to check on Chester, but otherwise displaying the kind of patience that suggested he'd been through medical examinations before. "What I know," Doc said finally, "is that someone's been taking good care of these animals. What I don't know is why that someone wants it kept quiet. But you have theories. I have observations. 7 healthy, well-trained dogs don't just appear in a town like Copper Ridge by accident, and they don't stay healthy eating scraps and sleeping rough, no matter how dedicated their caretaker might be." Chester thought about the black sedan, about Rex's immediate trust, about the way all 7 dogs responded to their names as if they'd been called those names before. "Someone's been watching them. Watching me. Could be." "Doc, if you know something—" "What I know," Palmer interrupted, his voice carrying the weight of professional discretion, "is that sometimes people have reasons for doing things that don't make sense from the outside, and sometimes those reasons are good ones, even if they're complicated." He finished, bandaging Rex's leg, and stepped back. "Keep that wound clean and dry. Bring him back in a week to have the stitches removed. And Chester?" "Yeah? If I were you, I'd start paying attention to who else might be paying attention to you." Outside the clinic, Chester settled Rex carefully in his arms again. The other dogs had waited, arranged in a loose semicircle that spoke of discipline and training. As they began the walk back toward Chester's cabin, he noticed the black sedan was gone, but the feeling of being watched remained. That afternoon, Chester sat at his kitchen table with his journal open, staring at a blank page. "How do you record the day everything you thought you knew started coming apart? How do you write about crystal glass in a stray dog's paw, about expensive cars with tinted windows, about the growing certainty that nothing in your carefully ordered world was what it seemed? Instead," he wrote, "Rex injured. Glass in leg. Not local glass. Doc Palmer knows more than he's saying. Dogs, not strays." The question mark hung at the end of that final sentence like a door slightly ajar, waiting for someone with courage enough to push it open and see what lay beyond. High on the bluff, Vivienne Sterling lowered her binoculars and closed her eyes. She'd watched Chester carry Rex to the clinic, had seen the careful way he examined the wound, the gentle authority with which he handled the injured animal. She'd also seen the moment when he began to question what he thought he knew. The crystal glass had come from her terrace, where she'd been having her evening brandy when the wind knocked over her glass. She'd cleaned up what she could find, but Rex must have picked up a shard on his paws during one of his nightly visits home. Now her carelessness had forced a decision she'd been avoiding for 2 years. Chester Hayes was asking questions. Soon, those questions would lead him to answers. And when they did, Vivienne Sterling would have to decide whether the test she'd been conducting was worth the risk of letting another human being pass the walls she'd built around her heart. The brass property deed in her safe seemed to pulse with significance. She owned this town, these buildings, these streets where Chester walked each morning with such faithful purpose. She owned the responsibility for Copper Ridge's future, and she was beginning to suspect that future might depend on a weathered mountain man who talked to dogs and never asked for anything in return. Tomorrow, she would have to decide whether to reveal herself or let Chester continue searching for answers that might change everything for both of them. The faded photograph lay tucked between the pages of Richard Sterling's favorite book, a leather-bound volume of Thoreau that Vivienne had never been able to read after his death. She'd discovered it there while searching for anything that might guide her decision about Chester Hayes, and the image had stopped her cold. 7 puppies tumbled across a manicured lawn, while Richard knelt among them, his face bright with the kind of joy that seemed impossible now. The date scrawled on the back read, "Spring 2019, our pack complete." Chester's investigation began with questions that felt awkward in his mouth. He wasn't a man given to gossip or prying, but Rex's injury had shattered his assumptions about the 7 dogs, and he found himself needing answers with an urgency that surprised him. "Frank," he said to the store owner while buying supplies for Rex's recovery, "what do you know about the lady on the hill?" Frank Kowalski looked up from tallying Chester's purchases, his eyebrows rising slightly. In 2 years of regular visits, Chester had never asked about anything more personal than weather or the price of coffee. "Vivienne Sterling, you mean?" "Not much. Truth be told, moved up there about 3 years ago, right after her husband died. Richard Sterling, he was some kind of railroad investor, made a fortune connecting remote places to the wider world." Frank paused, studying Chester's face. "Why the sudden interest?" Chester chose his words carefully. "Just curious about neighbors. She's a quiet one. Has everything delivered from Helena, pays her bills through some business manager in Chicago. Nancy at the post office says she gets packages regular-like, but never any personal mail. No visitors that anyone's seen." Frank leaned across the counter, lowering his voice. "Though I'll tell you something odd, sometimes I see her car in town late at night, just driving around slow-like. Never stops, never gets out. Just drives." The information settled in Chester's mind, like puzzle pieces that didn't quite fit. A wealthy widow who drove through town but never stopped. Who lived isolated on the bluff but seemed to watch the streets below. It painted a picture of someone hiding from something, or perhaps hiding something from others. His next stop was the post office, where Nancy Chen proved more forthcoming than usual. The death of her husband 2 months prior had left her eager for conversation, and Chester represented one of the few regular human contacts in her increasingly quiet days. "Mrs. Sterling? Oh, she's a mystery, that one. Beautiful woman, probably 65 or so, but carries herself like someone much younger. Drives that black sedan like she's afraid of being seen." Nancy sorted mail while she talked, her movements quick and efficient. "Her business manager sends her a check every month, and she sends back signed papers. Very official, very formal. But you know what's interesting?" Chester waited. "She's been asking about local businesses, quiet-like, through her manager. Which ones are struggling, who owns what properties, that sort of thing. Almost like she's thinking about investing, though she's never made any moves that I can see." The picture grew more complex, a wealthy widow researching local businesses but remaining invisible herself. Chester thought about the brass property deed he'd glimpsed in legal documents when he'd helped settle his grandfather's estate years ago. Property ownership in small towns was usually public knowledge, but he'd never thought to investigate who owned what in Copper Ridge. "Nancy, you know who owns most of the buildings downtown?" "Well, that's an interesting question." Nancy set down her mail sorting and gave Chester her full attention. "Used to be all split up among different families, but over the past few years, most of the properties have been bought up by something called Sterling Enterprises. They bought them quiet-like, through lawyers and such. Nobody much paid attention because the new owners didn't change anything, same rents, same terms. But if I had to guess, I'd say someone's been quietly acquiring most of downtown Copper Ridge. The name hit. Chester like cold water. Sterling Enterprises. Vivienne Sterling. The wealthy widow on the hill wasn't just watching Copper Ridge from a distance, she was buying it, piece by piece. That afternoon, Chester found himself walking different routes through town, seeing it through new eyes. The buildings that still operated, the ones that had closed, the empty lots where structures had been torn down, all of it potentially under the control of someone who observed but never participated, who owned but never revealed herself. Doc Palmer's clinic occupied a building Chester had never thought to question. When he stopped by to check on Rex's recovery, he found himself studying the structure with new attention. "Doc, who owns this building?" Palmer looked up from his paperwork, his expression carefully neutral. "Why do you ask?" "Just curious about the town's history. Sterling Enterprises bought it about 18 months ago. Kept all the same terms, didn't raise my rent, didn't ask me to change anything. Good landlords, actually better than the previous owners who let things slide." Chester felt pieces clicking into place. "Doc, how long have you been seeing these 7 dogs?" The older man set down his pen and studied Chester's face. "You're asking a lot of questions today. Rex's injury got me thinking about where they might have come from, who might have been caring for them before." "Before what?" "Before they became strays." Doc Palmer was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of carefully considered words. "Chester, what if I told you those dogs were never strays? What if someone had good reasons for letting them roam free, but was still making sure they were cared for?" "I'd ask what kind of reasons. The kind that involve testing whether a place like Copper Ridge still has people worth caring about." The words hung in the air between them like a challenge. Chester thought about his morning routine, about the faithful way the dogs appeared each day, about their excellent health, despite supposedly living rough. He thought about expensive crystal glass and black sedans with tinted windows. "Someone's been watching me," he said. "Could be. Someone who owns half the town and has 7 well-trained dogs. Could be that too." Chester felt a familiar sensation from his military days, the moment when scattered. Intelligence coalesced into a clear picture of what you were really facing. The 7 dogs weren't strays. They belonged to Vivienne Sterling, the mysterious widow who owned most of Copper Ridge but never showed herself. And somehow, his daily routine of feeding them had become part of something larger than simple kindness. "Doc, what kind of test involves releasing dogs into a dying town? The kind that wants to know if there's still hope worth saving." That evening, Chester sat on his cabin's small porch, watching the lights come on in the mansion on the bluff. For the first time, since he'd started feeding the dogs, he found himself wondering who was watching him from behind those distant windows, and what they'd concluded from 2 years of observation. The dogs lay arrayed around his porch like sentinels, content but alert. Rex's bandaged leg didn't seem to bother him much, and he rested his head on Chester's boot with the familiarity of long friendship. But now Chester wondered, was this friendship or was it something else? Had these animals chosen him, or had they been sent to him? High on the bluff, Vivienne Sterling stood at her window with the faded photograph in her hand. Tomorrow, she would have to decide whether Chester Hayes had passed her test and whether she was brave enough to face the consequences of revealing herself to a man who had unknowingly become the answer to her questions about hope, kindness, and the possibility of connection in forgotten places. The hand-carved wooden whistle had taken Chester 3 evenings to complete, working by lamplight with the kind of focused patience that came from years of finding purpose in small tasks. Carved from a piece of birch that had fallen near his cabin, the whistle produced a clear, sweet note that seemed to call the dogs from whatever dreams occupied their sleeping hours. He'd made it because talking felt insufficient sometimes, because there were moments when connection required something deeper than words. Chester's investigation had led him to the edge of Vivienne Sterling's property, where a discreet sign marked the boundary between public land and private holdings. The fence was understated but well-maintained wooden posts and wire that suggested boundaries without appearing hostile. Beyond it, the land rose toward the mansion, in carefully managed slopes that spoke of professional landscaping and considerable expense. The dogs knew this area. As Chester approached the property line during their morning walk, their behavior changed in subtle ways that only Patu, 2 years of observation, allowed him to recognize. Rex's ears pricked forward with familiar alertness. Duchess moved with the confident gait of an animal on known ground. Even Shadow, who typically maintained careful distances, pressed closer to the fence, as if drawn by invisible threads. "You know this place, don't you?" Chester murmured, watching their reactions. He tested his theory with the whistle, producing the clear note he'd perfected over the past few days. The response was immediate and startling. All 7 dogs turned toward the fence with synchronized precision, their tails wagging in unison as if responding to a signal they'd been trained to recognize. But more telling was what happened next. 3 distinct barks echoed from somewhere beyond the fence, answered immediately by Rex and Duchess in what sounded like conversation rather than random noise. Chester felt the pieces of his carefully ordered world shifting again. These weren't responses to a stranger's whistle. These were the responses of animals returning to familiar territory, greeting known voices, following patterns established over time. The sound of an approaching vehicle made him turn. The black sedan moved slowly down the mountain road, its progress deliberate rather than hurried. Chester gathered the dogs with quiet commands, noting how readily they responded to his voice, even as their attention remained fixed on the approaching car. As the sedan passed, he caught a glimpse of the driver, a woman with silver hair, pulled back in an elegant style, her profile sharp and patrician even through tinted glass. She didn't slow or acknowledge his presence, but something about her careful attention to the road ahead suggested awareness of his proximity. Vivienne Sterling. It had to be. And she'd been close enough to see him clearly, to observe his interaction with the dogs, to draw whatever conclusions mattered to someone who owned most of a dying town, but never showed herself to its residents. That afternoon brought revelations that arrived in the form of anonymous gifts. Chester discovered them while returning from town, a bag of premium dog food left beside his porch, along with a small cooler containing what appeared to be homemade dog treats. No note, no explanation, just provisions that suggested someone understood exactly what he needed. The dog food was expensive, the kind sold in specialty pet stores, not the generic brands available at Frank's General Store. The treats were clearly homemade, formed into perfect bite-sized portions and baked to exactly the right consistency. Someone with considerable resources and evident affection for dogs had provided these supplies. Chester examined the packaging carefully. No store labels, no identifying marks, but the cooler was high quality and appeared new. Someone had gone to considerable trouble to provide for the dogs while maintaining complete anonymity. The pattern continued over the following days. Medical supplies appeared for Rex's ongoing care: antibiotic ointment, fresh bandages, even pain medication with instructions written in precise handwriting on plain paper. Small toys materialized that the dogs greeted with recognition rather than curiosity. A heavy blanket appeared during a cold snap, perfectly sized for multiple dogs to share. Each gift was useful, thoughtful, and completely anonymous. But Chester began to notice something else. The dogs accepted these items without the wariness they'd shown toward unfamiliar objects when he'd first started feeding them. They knew these things, had seen them before, treated them as returning possessions rather than unexpected gifts. His military training reasserted itself as Chester analyzed the situation with tactical clarity. Someone with resources, local knowledge, and obvious affection for these animals was supporting his care of them while maintaining complete operational security. The gifts appeared when he was away from his cabin, placed with precision that suggested surveillance of his movements. The timing was too perfect for coincidence, but surveillance required more than casual observation. It required systematic monitoring, careful planning, and resources that suggested this wasn't the work of a casual Good Samaritan. Someone was investing considerable time and effort in watching him, in supporting his relationship with the dogs, in maintaining a connection that remained deliberately invisible. The realization brought both comfort and unease. Comfort, because it confirmed that the dog's excellent health wasn't accidental. Someone with means and knowledge was ensuring their well-being. Unease, because it meant his daily routine had become part of someone else's agenda, his choices observed and perhaps influenced by motivations he didn't understand. Chester's own past began pressing against his consciousness as he grappled with being watched. Military service had taught him to recognize surveillance, but it had also taught him the weight of carrying secrets that couldn't be shared. His unit's final mission, the one that had ended his career and sent him seeking solitude in places like Copper Ridge, had involved decisions made in darkness, consequences that followed him across years and miles. He understood why someone might choose to care from a distance, to help without revealing themselves, to test the world's capacity for kindness without risking their own vulnerability. But understanding didn't diminish the questions that accumulated like winter snow, building layers of uncertainty that threatened the simple routine that had given his life structure. The evening routine took on new significance as Chester distributed the anonymous dog food and watched the animals respond with familiar enthusiasm. Each dog had preferences, patterns, small rituals that spoke of long-standing relationships. Murphy always ate slowly. Duchess always finished first. Shadow always waited until the others had started before approaching his portion. These weren't learned behaviors developed over 2 years of sporadic feeding. These were established patterns, household routines that suggested months or years of consistent care in controlled environments. As darkness settled over Copper Ridge, Chester found himself studying the lights in the mansion on the bluff with new understanding. Someone in that distant house was watching him as carefully as he was beginning to watch them. Someone who knew these dogs, who cared about their well-being, who had chosen to let them roam free while ensuring they remained safe. The hand-carved whistle felt warm in his pocket, a tangible connection to animals that had become family even as they remained mysteries. Tomorrow, he would continue following the threads that led toward truth, toward understanding, toward a confrontation with whoever had been orchestrating this elaborate dance of care and secrecy. But tonight, surrounded by 7 dogs who trusted him completely while belonging to someone else entirely, Chester Hayes began to understand that some questions demanded answers, regardless of the consequences of asking them. The Sterling family railroad watch had stopped at 3:47 a.m. on the morning Richard died, and Vivienne had never wound it again. She carried it in her pocket like a talisman, a reminder that time could end without warning and leave the living suspended between what was and what might have been. The weight of it against her leg felt heavier each day as she watched Chester Hayes grow closer to discovering the truth she'd been hiding for 2 years. Chester's tracking skills, honed by years of reading landscapes and following game trails, led him along paths the dogs had worn through the forest between his cabin and the Sterling property. The routes were subtle, not the direct lines that humans preferred, but the meandering paths that animals chose when moving between territories they considered home. The discovery of the elaborate dog houses came as a shock that left Chester standing motionless among the trees, staring at structures that redefined everything he thought he knew about the 7 animals he'd been feeding. These weren't crude shelters cobbled together from scraps. They were professional constructions, built from cedar and designed with the kind of attention to detail that spoke of serious money and genuine affection. Each house was sized for its intended occupant and marked with nameplates that made Chester's breath catch in his throat. Rex, Duchess, Shadow, Bandit, Scout, Penny, Murphy. The names he'd given them over months of careful observation were the names they'd always carried. Someone had known exactly which dog he would call by which name, had predicted his choices with accuracy that suggested either remarkable insight or long observation of his character. The feeding stations were equally elaborate, elevated bowls designed to promote healthy eating posture, automatic water dispensers that ensured fresh supply, weatherproof storage for food that never seemed to run empty. This was a facility designed for the long-term care of beloved animals, not a temporary arrangement for strays. Chester moved through the installation with the careful attention he'd once used to analyze enemy positions. Fresh food in the bowls, recently filled water dispensers, ground around the houses, worn smooth by regular use. This wasn't abandoned infrastructure, it was an active facility, maintained and supplied by someone who visited regularly. But it was the view from the dog houses that truly illuminated the scope of what he'd discovered. From this position on the hillside, Chester could see his cabin clearly, could trace the exact route he took each morning to reach Main and Prospect Streets. Someone sitting here could observe his entire routine, could time his movements, could predict his behavior with the precision required to maintain this elaborate deception. Vivienne Sterling had been closer than he'd imagined, watching not just from the distant mansion, but from these carefully positioned observation points. The dogs lived between two homes, his rough kindness and her sophisticated care, and somehow maintained loyalty to both, without revealing the truth of their situation. The sound of footsteps on the trail behind him made Chester turn, his hand moving instinctively toward the knife he carried out of habit rather than necessity. But it was only Doc Palmer, approaching with the careful steps of a man who'd expected to find exactly what they were both now looking at. "Figured you'd get here eventually," Doc said, his voice carrying resignation rather than surprise. "You knew about this. I've known about it since the beginning. Been helping maintain the medical supplies, checking on their health, when Mrs. Sterling requested it." Doc Palmer gestured toward the elaborate setup. "This isn't the work of someone who doesn't care about these animals." Chester felt anger building, not the hot fury of betrayal, but the cold burn of being made a fool. 2 years, Doc. 2 years I've been thinking I was helping strays, worrying about them in bad weather, saving scraps from my own meals to keep them fed. And they appreciated every bit of it. Look at how they respond to you, Chester. That's not training or manipulation, that's genuine affection, built on a lie, built on kindness that didn't depend on ownership or reward. Doc moved closer to one of the dog houses, running his hand along the smooth cedar. She could have just kept them up at the house, could have hired someone to care for them properly. Instead, she released them to see if anyone in this dying town still had enough compassion to care for creatures that needed help. The pieces assembled themselves in Chester's mind with mechanical precision. Vivienne Sterling, wealthy widow, testing the character of Copper Ridge by releasing 7 beloved dogs and watching to see what happened. Her expectations had probably been low, a few scraps here and there, perhaps casual tolerance from people too focused on their own problems to invest in strays. Instead, she'd found Chester Hayes, a man who talked to dogs like family and carved whistles to call them home. "It was a test," he said. "It was hope," Doc corrected. She lost her husband, lost her faith in people's capacity for goodness. The dogs were her way of asking whether there was still something worth saving in places like Copper Ridge. Chester thought about the anonymous gifts, the careful timing, the resources invested in maintaining this elaborate fiction. And what was her conclusion? You'd have to ask her that yourself. The suggestion hung in the air between them like a challenge. Chester looked up toward the mansion, visible through the trees as a distant promise of answers and confrontation. For 2 years, he'd been an unwitting participant in someone else's experiment, his character tested and measured without his knowledge or consent. But as he considered his anger, Chester found it complicated by other emotions. The dogs had never been strays, but his care for them had been real. The kindness he'd shown hadn't been wasted, even if it had been observed and evaluated. And whoever Vivienne Sterling was, whatever her motivations, she'd invested considerable resources in ensuring the animals' well-being while allowing them the freedom to form bonds with him. The railroad watch in her pocket seemed to pulse with significance as Vivienne Sterling stood at her window, watching the two figures move through her carefully constructed secret. Chester Hayes had found the doghouses, had discovered the truth she'd been protecting, and now stood at the threshold of decisions that would determine the future of everything she'd built in this forgotten corner of Montana. Richard's dream of revitalizing Copper Ridge lived in blueprints hidden in her safe, in property deeds that gave her the power to rebuild or abandon this dying town. But those dreams had remained frozen at 3:47 a.m. for 2 years, waiting for someone to prove that hope still existed in places the world had forgotten. Chester Hayes might be that proof, but only if she found the courage to wind the watch again, to let time move forward, to risk the vulnerability that came with revealing herself to someone who had unknowingly become the answer to questions she'd been afraid to ask. The Copper Ridge mine map lay spread across Doc Palmer's examining table like a testament to vanished dreams. Its faded ink traced the original survey lines that had brought Richard Sterling to this remote valley, marking mineral deposits and water sources with the optimism of men who believed the earth would yield its treasures forever. Vivienne had given Doc the map years ago, hoping his practical knowledge might help her understand what her husband had seen in this dying place. Chester confronted Doc Palmer with the directness of a man who'd run out of patience for half-truths and careful omissions. The clinic felt smaller with tension filling the space between them, and Doc's usual calm seemed strained by the weight of secrets he'd been carrying. "I want the whole truth this time," Chester said, his voice carrying the kind of authority that came from years of command. "No more hints and suggestions. Who is Vivienne Sterling, and what exactly has she been testing?" Doc Palmer sat heavily in his chair, suddenly looking every one of his 63 years. "She's a woman who lost everything that mattered to her and decided to find out if there was still goodness left in the world. That's not an answer. It's the only answer that matters." Doc pulled the mind map toward himself, tracing the survey lines with one finger. Richard Sterling came here 5 years ago with plans to revitalize Copper Ridge, not just the mine, the whole town. He saw potential where everyone else saw decay. Chester studied the map, noting the careful annotations in Richard's handwriting. Water rights, timber access, railroad connections, mineral deposits, everything needed to transform a dying mining town into something sustainable and prosperous. "He died before he could implement any of it," Doc continued. "Heart attack, sudden and final. Left Vivienne with more money than most people see in 10 lifetimes, and a plan she didn't know how to execute alone. So she tested the town instead. She tested whether the people were worth saving." The words hit Chester like cold water. 2 years of feeding dogs, of building routines around kindness, of finding purpose in simple acts of care. All of it had been evaluation, measurement, assessment of his character by someone who remained hidden and untouchable. And what was her conclusion? Doc Palmer was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of professional confidence. "That depends on what you mean by conclusion. She's been watching you for 2 years, Chester. Watching how you treat animals that can't repay your kindness. How you maintain routines even when nobody notices. How you talk to dogs like they're family because they're the only family you've allowed yourself to have." The accuracy of that observation stung. Chester had built his life around solitude, around avoiding the kinds of connections that could be lost or betrayed. The dogs had slipped past his defenses precisely because they seemed like strays safe to care for, because they belonged to no one, asked for nothing but scraps and attention. "Her business manager called yesterday," Doc continued. She's under pressure to sell her Copper Ridge holdings. Some development company out of Denver wants to buy everything: the town, the land, the mineral rights. They're offering enough money to make keeping this place seem like sentimentality rather than investment. Chester felt something cold settle in his stomach. And she's considering it. Has been for months. The only thing stopping her is the question of whether Copper Ridge still has people worth preserving. The mind map took on new significance as Chester understood its implications. If Vivienne Sterling sold to developers, the town would disappear, not gradually, like it had been dying for years, but completely and finally. The few remaining families would be forced out, the buildings demolished, the landscape transformed into whatever promised the highest return on investment. She has that much power? Sterling Enterprises owns 73% of the town, including most of the commercial buildings and a significant portion of the residential properties. Richard acquired them quietly over 3 years, always through intermediaries, always with plans for renovation rather than demolition. Doc folded the map carefully, his movements deliberate and precise. Vivienne inherited not just wealth, but responsibility for this entire community. Chester's military past pressed against his consciousness as he grappled with the scope of what he'd learned. Command had taught him to think strategically, to understand how individual actions fit into larger operations. His daily routine of feeding dogs had been tactical intelligence, gathering a way for Vivienne Sterling to assess the character of Copper Ridge's remaining residents without revealing her own position. What did she learn about me? That you're exactly the kind of person Richard hoped still existed in places like this. The answer carried implications that Chester wasn't ready to examine. 2 years of observation had apparently convinced Vivienne Sterling that he represented something worth preserving, but preservation came with obligations he'd never agreed to accept. That evening, Chester sat on his porch with the 7 dogs arranged around him in their familiar patterns. But now their presence carried different weight. They weren't strays who'd chosen him, they were emissaries from a world of wealth and power that he'd spent years avoiding. Their loyalty was real, but it was layered with complexity that transformed simple affection into something that felt like manipulation. Rex pressed his head against Chester's hand, seeking the kind of attention that had become routine between them. But Chester found himself wondering what the dog understood about the situation, whether his responses were genuine or trained, whether the bond between them was built on truth or careful orchestration. The dogs began bringing small gifts during their evening visit: smooth stones, interesting sticks, wild flowers that seemed chosen for their beauty rather than found by accident. Chester had noticed this behavior occasionally over the past months, but now it took on sinister significance. Were these spontaneous offerings, or had they been taught to present tokens that would appeal to his sense of connection? His paranoia felt justified but exhausting. 2 years of simple routine had been replaced by questions that had no satisfying answers. Every interaction with the dogs now carried the possibility of hidden meaning. Every moment of connection shadowed by the knowledge that someone else was watching and drawing conclusions. High on the bluff, Vivienne Sterling made her decision with the kind of finality that came from months of careful consideration. Tomorrow, she would reveal herself to Chester Hayes, would offer him the truth she'd been protecting and the choices that came with it. Richard's pocket watch lay silent in her hand, its stopped hands pointing toward a moment when time had seemed to end. But time hadn't ended. It had only paused, waiting for someone brave enough to wind the mechanism again and let the future begin. The handwritten letter lay hidden beneath Chester's spare blanket, 23 pages of words he'd never been able to send. It had taken him 3 months to write after returning from overseas, each sentence carved from grief and guilt with the precision of a man who understood that some truths were too heavy to carry alone, but too dangerous to share. The letter began, "Dear Sarah and Emma," and ended with, "I'm sorry I couldn't save you." and in between lay the confession of a soldier who'd made impossible choices in impossible circumstances. The storm arrived with the suddenness that made Montana weather legendary, transforming an overcast afternoon into a maelstrom of wind and rain that turned the mountain roads treacherous. Chester had been tracking the dog's route back toward the Sterling property when the first lightning struck, close enough to make the air smell of ozone and electricity. Rex led the group with the purposeful determination of an animal heading home, and this time Chester followed without hesitation. The discovery of the dog houses had shattered his assumptions about their status as strays, but it hadn't diminished their obvious affection for him. If anything, their loyalty seemed deeper now, as if they sensed his confusion and sought to bridge the gap between what he'd believed and what he was learning. The path they followed led not to the elaborate dog facilities he'd discovered, but higher up the mountain toward the mansion itself. Through sheets of rain, Chester caught glimpses of the structure that had dominated the horizon for 2 years without revealing its secrets. It was larger than he'd expected, built from local stone and timber in a style that suggested permanence rather than ostentation. When Rex led them directly to a covered porch, Chester understood they'd been brought here deliberately. The dogs settled under the shelter with the familiarity of animals returning to known territory, and Chester found himself face to face with a decision he'd been avoiding since discovering the truth about their ownership. He could turn around, return to his cabin, and pretend he'd never followed the dogs this far. Or he could knock on the door and confront the woman who'd been orchestrating his life from a distance for 2 years. Thunder made the decision for him. The storm intensified with violent suddenness, turning the mountain road back to town into a river of mud and debris that would be impassable until the weather cleared. Chester was stranded, and the dogs seemed to know it. The door opened before he could knock. Vivienne Sterling stood in the doorway with the kind of composed elegance that spoke of generations of careful breeding and considerable wealth. She was younger than he'd expected, probably mid-60s rather than the elderly widow he'd imagined, with silver hair pulled back in a simple style and eyes that held intelligence and something that might have been loneliness. "Mr. Hayes," she said, her voice carrying the cultured tones of education and travel. "I was wondering when we'd finally meet, properly." The dogs filed past Chester into the house with the casual confidence of animals returning home, leaving him standing on the porch, like a supplicant, seeking shelter. The absurdity of the situation, being introduced to someone by dogs who belonged to her but had adopted him, struck Chester as profoundly surreal. "Mrs. Sterling." He removed his hat, water dripping from the brim. "I followed the dogs. The storm. Please, come inside. You're soaked through." The interior of the house surprised Chester with its warmth and lived-in comfort. He'd expected the sterile perfection that money could buy, but instead found a home that suggested someone who valued books, music, and memories over mere display. The dogs settled in various locations with the easy familiarity of long-time residents, confirming what Chester had already begun to understand. "They've been telling me about you for 2 years, Vivienne said, hanging his wet coat by the fire. In their way, Chester watched Rex settle on a bed that was clearly his, in a spot that commanded a view of both the front door and the main living area. "You've been watching me." "Yes." She didn't deny it or attempt justification. "Would you like coffee? Something stronger?" "Coffee's fine." Chester remained standing, uncomfortable with the domesticity of the situation. 2 years of feeding these dogs in secret, and now he was having coffee with their actual owner in a house that probably cost more than most people earned in a lifetime. Vivienne moved through the kitchen with efficient grace, and Chester noticed how the dogs tracked her movements with the kind of attention that spoke of deep affection. Whatever else was true about this situation, her love for these animals was genuine. "You know their names," she said while preparing coffee. "The names you gave them. Rex, Duchess, Shadow, those are their names," Chester interrupted. "The names I gave them." "No." Vivienne turned to face him, her expression gentle but firm. "Those are the names they've always had, the names Richard gave them when they were puppies." The words hit Chester like physical blows. 2 years of careful observation, of learning each dog's personality and choosing names that seemed to fit their characters, and he'd simply rediscovered names they already carried. The precision was impossible to dismiss as coincidence. "You knew I'd call them by their right names." Richard said the right person would see their true natures, would understand who they were without being told. Vivienne brought him coffee in a mug that warmed his hands. "I released them into town because I needed to know if he was right about people, about goodness, about whether places like Copper Ridge still had residents worth saving." Chester felt the ground shifting beneath his certainties. It was all a test. It was all hope. She settled into a chair across from him, and Chester noticed how Murphy immediately came to rest his head on her knee. "After Richard died, I lost faith in everything we'd planned together. He believed people were fundamentally good, that communities could be rebuilt through kindness and shared purpose. I thought he was naive. And now I've watched you feed my dogs for 2 years, seen how you talk to them, noticed how you remember their preferences and worry about their health during bad weather. You've proven that Richard was right about at least one person in Copper Ridge." The letter, hidden in Chester's cabin, seemed to burn against his memory. 23 pages of confession about choices made in darkness, about the family he'd failed to save, about the guilt that had driven him to this remote place seeking solitude and penance. Vivienne Sterling had been testing his character while he'd been running from the memory of his failures. "Mrs. Sterling, there are things about me you don't know. I know you lost people you loved. I know you came here to hide from something painful. I know you've built walls around yourself so high that only stray dogs could slip past them." Her voice was gentle but direct. "I also know you've shown kindness without reward, responsibility without recognition, and love without expectation of return." Chester felt exposed in ways that had nothing to do with being caught in a storm. This woman had been studying him with the attention of a scientist, examining a specimen, drawing conclusions about his character that might be more accurate than his own self-assessment. "The dogs were never strays," he said. "No, but your care for them was real. You owned the town, most of it." Richard's dream was to revitalize Copper Ridge, to prove that dying places could be reborn if someone was willing to invest in their people rather than just their resources. Chester thought about the development company Doc Palmer had mentioned, about the pressure to sell, about the choice between preservation and profit that could determine the fate of everyone who called Copper Ridge home. "And what have you decided?" Vivienne Sterling was quiet for a long moment, listening to the storm rage outside and watching the 7 dogs who had served as her connection to a world she'd been afraid to enter directly. "That depends," she said finally, "on whether you're willing to help me fulfill a dead man's dream." The blueprint plans covered Vivienne's dining room table like a map to a promised land, their careful lines and precise annotations revealing Richard Sterling's vision for Copper Ridge in stunning detail. Each sheet represented months of research and planning, from infrastructure improvements to sustainable business development, from historical preservation to modern amenities. The papers seemed to pulse with possibility as Chester studied them by lamplight, understanding for the first time the scope of dreams that had died with one man's heart attack. Richard spent 3 years developing these plans. Vivienne said, moving between the kitchen and dining room as she prepared dinner for both of them. The dogs had settled throughout the house in configurations that spoke of established routine, and Chester found their presence oddly comforting, despite everything he'd learned about deception and testing. He consulted with economists, environmental specialists, historians, even social workers who specialized in rural community development. Chester traced the proposed route of a new hiking trail with one finger, noting how it connected the town to scenic overlooks while avoiding environmentally sensitive areas. This isn't just renovation. This is complete transformation, built on the foundation of what already exists. Richard believed that dying places could be reborn if someone was willing to invest in their potential rather than just extracting their resources. The plans included details that took Chester's breath away in their scope and ambition. A heritage center showcasing the town's mining history, a craftsman village where artists could live and work affordably, sustainable energy systems that would make Copper Ridge energy independent, even a small conference center designed to attract visitors interested in mountain recreation and historical tourism. The cost, Chester began, is significant but not prohibitive. Richard left me with resources that could fund this entire project without requiring loans or outside investment. The question isn't whether we can afford to revitalize Copper Ridge, but whether we should. Chester looked up from the blueprints to find Vivienne watching him with the kind of careful attention he'd grown to associate with being evaluated. And that depends on the people. It depends on whether the people still here are worth saving, and whether they're willing to be part of something larger than their individual problems. The weight of that assessment settled heavily on Chester's shoulders. For 2 years, Vivienne had been testing not just his character, but his potential as a leader, as someone who could bridge the gap between her resources and the community's needs. The dogs had been her scouts, and he'd been her unwitting candidate for a role he'd never sought. Mrs. Sterling, I'm not the man you think I am. You're exactly the man I think you are. The question is whether you're willing to accept the responsibility that comes with that assessment. The evening passed in revelations that recontextualized everything Chester thought he knew about his 2 years in Copper Ridge. Vivienne had been watching not just him, but the entire community, observing how people responded to hardship, how they treated each other when they thought no one was paying attention, how they dealt with the slow death of their town. Nancy Chen at the post office, she said, while they ate dinner that tasted better than anything Chester had prepared for himself in years. She's been quietly organizing food deliveries to families who can't afford groceries. Never takes credit, never asks for recognition, just makes sure children don't go hungry. Frank Kowalski keeps the store running at a loss because he knows people need a place to gather, to feel connected to something larger than their own problems. He could have closed down and moved to Helena 2 years ago, but he stays because someone has to keep the lights on. Each example built a picture of a community that hadn't given up despite overwhelming reasons to surrender. People were caring for each other in small ways that added up to something larger than the sum of their individual efforts. And Doc Palmer, Vivienne continued, has been treating people for free when they can't afford veterinary care for their animals, because he understands that sometimes pets are the only family people have left. Chester thought about his own relationship with the 7 dogs, about how they'd become his anchor to purpose and connection. When everything else felt temporary and uncertain, you've been cataloging acts of kindness. I've been documenting evidence that Richard was right about human nature, that people are fundamentally good, even when they're struggling, even when they feel forgotten by the larger world. The blueprint plans seemed to glow with possibility as Chester understood their true significance. This wasn't just about rebuilding buildings or attracting tourists. It was about proving that communities could be reborn through investment in their people rather than exploitation of their resources. But the evening also brought sobering realities that threatened everything Richard had envisioned. Vivienne's business manager had been pressing her for months to accept the Denver Development Company's offer, pointing out that sentiment was a poor substitute for sound fiscal planning. They want to strip mine the surrounding mountains and build a luxury resort for people who want to experience authentic Montana, without any of the discomforts that come with actually living here, Vivienne explained. They've promised to relocate the remaining families, but relocation means displacement. These people wouldn't be welcome in the artificial Montana they plan to create. Chester studied the development company's preliminary plans, which Vivienne had obtained through her business connections. The resort would cater to wealthy tourists seeking wilderness experiences with five-star amenities, and it required the complete transformation of Copper Ridge from a working community into a themed destination. When do you have to decide? The deadline is next week. They've made it clear that their offer expires then, and they have other locations under consideration if I'm not interested in moving forward. The pressure felt immense as Chester grappled with implications that extended far beyond his simple routine of feeding dogs. Families would be displaced, a way of life would disappear, and a community's identity would be erased in favor of profit margins and tourist fantasies. What do you need from me? I need you to help me convince the town council that Richard's vision is worth pursuing. I need someone who understands this community from the inside, who can speak for the people who've been making it work despite everything that's tried to destroy it. Chester felt the familiar weight of command responsibility, the knowledge that decisions made in crisis moments could determine the fate of people who'd placed their trust in someone else's judgment. His military career had ended because he'd been willing to make such decisions when others hesitated, and the cost had been higher than anyone should have to pay. There's a town council meeting tomorrow night, Vivienne continued. Emergency session called because the development company has been putting pressure on individual council members, offering personal incentives for support of their proposal. The manipulation felt familiar to Chester divide-and-conquer tactics designed to fragment opposition before it could organize effectively. His strategic training kicked in automatically, analyzing the situation with the kind of tactical clarity that had kept his unit alive in hostile territory. They're trying to force a decision before the community can consider alternatives. Exactly, and they're close to succeeding. 3 of the 5 council members are already leaning toward accepting their offer, convinced that half a loaf is better than watching the whole thing crumble to nothing. Chester looked around Vivienne's house, noting the comfortable mixture of wealth and warmth that suggested someone who understood the difference between luxury and home. The dogs lay scattered throughout the room, in positions that allowed them to monitor both humans, their presence a reminder of the bonds that had brought him to this moment of decision. If I agree to help you, what exactly are you asking me to do? Speak for the people who've been keeping this community alive through kindness and stubbornness. Help me present Richard's vision as a viable alternative to surrender. Show the council that Copper Ridge is worth saving because its people are worth investing in. The handwritten letter hidden in Chester's cabin seemed to press against his memory, 23 pages of confession about the last time he'd been responsible for other people's lives. But as he studied the blueprint plans spread across Vivienne's table, Chester began to understand that some responsibilities couldn't be avoided, regardless of past failures or personal fears. The 7 dogs had led him to this moment through 2 years of patient guidance, and now the choice was his: retreat to the safety of solitude or step forward into the kind of leadership that communities needed to survive. Tomorrow night, Copper Ridge would decide its own fate, and Chester Hayes would have to choose whether he was willing to help fight for a future that honored both dreams and the people who dared to pursue them. The community petition lay spread across the post office counter like a declaration of war, its single page filled with every signature Nancy Chen could gather in 24 hours of determined canvassing. Each name represented someone who refused to surrender Copper Ridge without a fight, and the document seemed to pulse with defiance as Chester studied the familiar handwriting of neighbors he'd barely spoken to, but who had somehow become his responsibility. The Denver Development Company's representatives arrived at dawn like an occupying force, their convoy of black SUVs and equipment trucks transforming Main Street into a staging area for corporate conquest. Chester watched from the general store's window as men in expensive suits directed crews to begin preliminary surveys, their confident efficiency suggesting a decision already made rather than a proposal under consideration. "They're not waiting for the council meeting," Frank Kowalski observed, his voice tight with anger. "They're acting like they already own the place. Chester recognized the tactics from his military experience: establish overwhelming presence, create the impression of inevitability, force opposition into reactive rather than proactive positions. The development company was playing psychological warfare, making resistance seem futile before formal battles even began. "Frank, how many people signed Nancy's petition?" 47. Every adult still living in Copper Ridge, plus some who moved away but still consider this home. Frank's hands clenched into fists as he watched surveyors mark property boundaries with spray paint. "Doesn't matter though, does it? They've got money and lawyers. We've got signatures and stubbornness." The morning brought revelations that transformed Chester's understanding of the stakes involved. Doc Palmer arrived at the store with legal documents that painted a grim picture of the development company's true intentions. The luxury resort was just the visible portion of their plans. The real profit would come from strip mining operations that would scar the surrounding mountains and poison the watershed that supplied water to communities throughout the valley. "They're calling it sustainable extraction," Doc said, his voice carrying the bitter edge of someone who'd seen too many euphemisms disguise environmental destruction. "But the geological surveys show they plan to remove entire mountain faces to reach mineral deposits that weren't economically viable when copper prices were lower." Chester studied the survey maps with tactical precision, noting how the proposed mining operations would create a dead zone around Copper Ridge that would make the luxury resort's wilderness marketing claims laughable. "They're planning to destroy the place they're claiming to preserve. Standard playbook. Extract maximum value, then abandon the site when it's no longer profitable. The resort will operate for maybe 10 years before the environmental damage makes it unsustainable." Vivienne Sterling's arrival shifted the dynamic of the morning, from defensive reaction to coordinated response. She moved through town with the kind of purposeful authority that came from owning most of it. But Chester noticed how she stopped to speak with individual residents rather than issuing proclamations from a distance. "Mrs. Chen, thank you for organizing the petition. Mr. Kowalski, I know you've kept this community functioning when others might have given up. Dr. Palmer, your medical care has been essential to people's well-being." Each acknowledgement was personal and specific, demonstrating that Vivienne's 2 years of observation had encompassed more than just Chester's dog-feeding routine. She knew these people, understood their contributions, recognized their worth in ways that corporate balance sheets never could. The development company's legal team established their command post in the abandoned hotel, transforming the building's lobby into a temporary office that buzzed with activity designed to intimidate through sheer professional competence. Chester counted 6 lawyers, 4 environmental consultants, and a public relations specialist whose job seemed to be spinning corporate exploitation as community development. "They're offering individual buyouts," Nancy reported after an uncomfortable meeting with the company's representatives. "Cash settlements for people willing to relocate voluntarily, with bonuses for signatures before the council meeting tonight." The divide and conquer strategy was working. 3 families had already accepted buyout offers, their signatures providing legal precedent for forced relocations if the development proposal passed. Chester watched neighbors eye each other with suspicion, wondering who might be tempted by cash offers that seemed generous until compared to the true value of what they'd be losing. "We need to present a unified front," Chester told the group that had gathered in Frank's store. "They're counting on us being too divided to resist effectively." But unity required leadership, and Chester felt the familiar weight of command settling on his shoulders, despite his efforts to avoid such responsibility. These people were looking to him for guidance, trusting him to help them fight battles he wasn't sure they could win. The 7 dogs appeared at the store's entrance, like reinforcements arriving just in time. Rex pressed against Chester's leg, with the kind of solid presence that steadied nerves and clarified thinking. The other dogs distributed themselves throughout the group, offering comfort that seemed orchestrated but felt genuine. "Mr. Hayes," Nancy said, her voice carrying the hope of someone who'd run out of other options. "Will you speak for us at the council meeting tonight?" The question hung in the air like a challenge that couldn't be declined without betraying everything Chester had discovered about duty, community, and the price of standing aside when good people needed someone willing to fight for them. "Yes," he said, the word carrying more weight than any decision he'd made since leaving the military. "I'll speak for all of us." The golden spike replica lay in Vivienne's palm, like a symbol of everything Richard had believed about connection, progress, and the power of human determination to bridge impossible distances. She'd carried it to the town council meeting as a reminder that railroads were built by people who understood that linking remote places to the wider world required faith in both engineering and community. Tonight, she would offer it to Chester as a token of partnership and hope. The Copper Ridge Community Center hadn't seen this many people in 5 years. Every folding chair was occupied, with additional residents standing along the walls and spilling into the Tuolo hallway. The development company's representatives sat at one table with their legal documents and financial projections arranged like weapons, while Chester and Vivienne faced them from across the room with nothing but Richard's blueprint plans and the community's determination. Council Chairman Bradley Morrison called the meeting to order with the weary authority of a man who'd been presiding over Copper Ridge's decline for too long. His voice carried resignation as he outlined the evening's agenda, a formal presentation from Apex Development Corporation, followed by community input, concluding with a binding vote on the company's acquisition proposal. "Before we begin," Morrison said, "I want everyone to understand that this decision will determine Copper Ridge's future for generations. Whatever we decide tonight, there's no going back." The development company's presentation was slick, professional, and carefully calculated to make resistance seem unreasonable. Their spokesman, a polished executive named Davidson, painted pictures of economic prosperity, job creation, and tourist revenue that would transform the valley into a destination for wealthy visitors seeking authentic Montana experiences. Apex Development has invested over $2 billion in similar projects across the American West, Davidson explained, his PowerPoint slides showing luxury resorts nestled in pristine wilderness settings. "Our model preserves natural beauty while creating sustainable revenue streams that benefit entire regions." Chester noticed what the presentation didn't show: the environmental damage hidden behind carefully cropped photographs, the displaced communities erased from marketing materials, the short-term profits that vanished when mining operations moved to more profitable locations. When Davidson concluded with financial projections that promised millions in tax revenue and hundreds of jobs, the council members looked tempted despite themselves. Even Morrison seemed impressed by numbers that dwarfed anything Copper Ridge had generated during its mining heyday. "Mr. Hayes," Morrison said, "you requested time to address the council on behalf of the community. The floor is yours." Chester stood slowly, feeling the weight of 47 signatures and 2 years of morning dog feedings pressing against his shoulders. The room fell silent as he walked to the front, carrying Richard's blueprint plans like sacred documents. "My name is Chester Hayes, and I've lived on the edge of this town for 2 years. I came here looking for solitude, but I found something better. I found neighbors." He spread the blueprint plans across the presentation table, their hand-drawn details contrasting sharply with Apex Development's corporate graphics. These plans were drawn by Richard Sterling, a man who believed that dying places could be reborn if someone was willing to invest in their people rather than just extract their resources. Chester's voice grew stronger as he described Richard's vision, the Heritage Center that would celebrate mining history rather than erase it, the craftsman village that would attract artists seeking affordable space and authentic community, the sustainable energy systems that would make Copper Ridge energy independent rather than dependent on corporate beneficence. Apex Development wants to buy our town so they can destroy it and build something else in its place. But we don't need to sell our identity to survive. We need to invest in the qualities that made this place worth saving in the first place. Vivienne rose to stand beside Chester, her presence adding weight to his words. Sterling Enterprises is prepared to fund Richard's complete revitalization plan, with one condition: that the community commits to being partners in building something better rather than passengers on someone else's profit train. The council chamber erupted in whispered conversations as residents processed the revelation that Vivienne Sterling had been among them all along, that the mysterious widow on the hill was offering them agency in their own future rather than displacement for someone else's vision. Davidson's polished confidence cracked as he realized his company's carefully orchestrated presentation was being upstaged by local people offering local solutions. Miss Sterling Apex Development has conducted extensive feasibility studies that demonstrate the economic impossibility of small-scale rural revitalization. Your husband's plans, while admirable in their sentiment, are financially unrealistic. My husband's plans, Vivienne replied, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd turned grief into purpose, are backed by resources that don't require corporate loans, environmental destruction, or community displacement. The question isn't whether we can afford to revitalize Copper Ridge, it's whether you can afford to lose the opportunity to be part of something authentic. Chester watched the council members' faces as they grappled with a choice they hadn't expected to have. Surrender to corporate development or partnership with community investment, displacement or empowerment, extraction or restoration. The 7 dogs had somehow found their way into the building, and they sat in a line along the back wall like witnesses to democracy in action. Rex caught Chester's eye and offered the kind of steady gaze that reminded him why he'd started feeding strays in the first place. Because kindness mattered, because small acts accumulated into larger meanings, because communities were built one relationship at a time. Council members, Chester concluded, holding up the golden spike replica Vivienne had placed in his hand, we have a choice between connection and extraction, between building something together or watching something else be built on our graves. I know which future Richard Sterling believed in. The question is which, the future we're brave enough to choose. The new welcome sign stood at the entrance to Copper Ridge like a promise fulfilled, its hand-carved letters reading, Copper Ridge, a community of care, in script that caught the morning light with the same warmth that had drawn Chester to feed 7 dogs 2.5 years ago. The sign had been crafted by Tommy Whitfield, a woodworker from Helena who'd moved to town as part of the Craftsman Village program, and it represented everything that had changed since the night the council voted to reject Apex Development's offer and embrace Richard Sterling's vision of renewal. Chester's morning routine had evolved, but never disappeared. He still walked the same path at dawn, still carried treats and conversation for the 7 dogs who waited for him at the corner of Main and Prospect. But now Vivienne often joined him, and the dogs moved freely between both homes, truly part of a family that had grown to encompass more than either human had expected when grief and solitude had brought them to this remote valley. The town itself showed signs of careful transformation that honored its history while embracing possibilities. Richard had sketched in his meticulous plans. The Heritage Center occupied the renovated mine office, its displays celebrating the immigrant families who'd carved prosperity from stone, and the modern residents who'd chosen preservation over profit. The Craftsman Village had attracted 12 artists and makers who valued authentic community over urban convenience, their studios and workshops bringing new energy to buildings that had stood empty for years. Frank Kowalski's general store had expanded into the adjacent building, transforming from a survival necessity into a gathering place that served locally made goods alongside traditional supplies. Nancy Chen had been elected mayor, her quiet competence and deep community knowledge, making her the natural choice to guide Copper Ridge's transition from dying town to sustainable community. Doc Palmer maintained his veterinary practice in the same building where he'd removed crystal glass from Rex's paw, but now he also served as the community's informal physician, his expanded role reflecting the trust that came from years of caring for both animals and their human families, without regard for ability to pay. The 7 dogs had become local celebrities, their story of bringing 2 lonely people together woven into Copper Ridge's mythology of renewal and hope. Visitors to the Heritage Center often asked about the dogs, who'd tested a community's capacity for kindness, and Chester found himself explaining their role with the mixture of pride and bewilderment that came from discovering your private life had become part of someone else's inspiration. Rex still bore the scar from his encounter with expensive crystal, but the mark had faded to a thin line that spoke of healing rather than injury. He remained the pack's unofficial leader, the dog most likely to approach strangers with the patient dignity that suggested he understood his role as ambassador for both kindness and community. The sustainable energy systems Richard had envisioned were generating their first power, solar panels and micro-hydro installations, making Copper Ridge energy independent while serving as a model for other rural communities facing similar challenges. The conference center hosted monthly workshops on sustainable development, bringing visitors who came to learn how small towns could thrive without surrendering their identities to corporate interests. Chester's role had evolved from reluctant spokesman to reluctant leader, his military experience and practical wisdom, making him valuable in ways he'd never sought but couldn't honestly refuse. He served on the town council, helped coordinate the Craftsman Village program, and found himself regularly consulted by other communities, seeking alternatives to corporate development or abandonment. The transformation hadn't been without challenges. Some longtime residents had accepted Apex Development's buyout offers and moved away, unable to adjust to changes that felt too rapid or too foreign to their understanding of what Copper Ridge should be. Others had embraced the opportunities, while maintaining skepticism about outsiders and new ideas. But the morning ritual that had started everything continued unchanged in its essential character. Chester walked through town at dawn, speaking to dogs who knew their names and neighbors who'd learned to value the quiet consistency of someone who showed up, regardless of weather, mood, or circumstance. The kindness that had begun as private routine had become public example, proof that small acts accumulated into larger meanings when maintained with faithful persistence. Vivienne had moved from the mansion on the bluff into a house on Main Street, choosing proximity to community over isolation with a view. The mansion had been converted into the conference center, its impressive architecture serving new purposes while maintaining the dignity Richard had envisioned when he'd planned their life together in this remote valley. The railroad watch that had stopped at 3:47 a.m. now kept perfect time, its movement regular and reliable as the sunrise that brought Chester and Vivienne together each morning to walk with 7 dogs through streets that bustled with purpose rather than merely enduring decline. Time had started again for both of them, measured not in losses that couldn't be recovered, but in possibilities that remained available to those brave enough to pursue them. On this particular morning, 6 months after the council vote that had changed everything, Chester found himself thinking about the handwritten letter still hidden in his cabin, 23 pages of confession and grief that seemed less urgent now, though no less true. He'd learned that carrying painful truths didn't require carrying them alone, that community could absorb individual burdens without being crushed by their weight. As they completed their circuit through town, Chester and Vivienne paused at the new welcome sign, admiring how Tommy Whitfield had captured something essential about what Copper Ridge had become. A community of care, not perfect, not without problems, but committed to the radical idea that people mattered more than profit. That kindness was a renewable resource that multiplied when shared rather than depleted. The 7 dogs arranged themselves around the sign like living punctuation marks to a story that had begun with simple feeding routines and evolved into something neither Chester nor Vivienne could have imagined when grief and solitude had brought them to the same forgotten corner of Montana. Together, they had proven Richard Sterling's faith in human goodness while discovering that hope was indeed worth the risk of caring for creatures, for community, and for each other.